welcome to the 12th episode of Recluse Horror. This is a daily horror movie review podcast. Just a little background on the project. Back in April, on my birthday, I decided I wanted to watch and review a horror movie every single day. I have done so for the past 279 days. Although this is only the 12th episode of the podcast. The original reviews were in text form. So, I'm on my own again today, and I actually feel like I may be developing a cold, which is super fun, so I apologize if I sound a little hoarse or anything. Hopefully it's just some weird thing in the air. Where I live, that's a definite possibility. So, every Friday, basically because of the alliteration, I review a foreign film, Foreign Friday. And today's film was JeruZalem from 2015. That's Jerusalem with a Z. Yeah, this one wasn't too bad. It comes from Israel, as you might expect, and it's by the directors and writers and all of that are the Paz brothers. I'm not sure if you'd pronounce that Paz or Paz, but I've heard the name thrown around a couple of times, but I checked their IMDb and they haven't done anything else that I've heard about. It might have all been some kind of hype from this movie. I'm not sure how well received it was, but I was pleasantly surprised. Now, I feel like this is a pretty valid sort of assumption to make, but usually when I see a Z where some other letter should be, it's usually an S. In a movie title, I assume it's going to be terrible, and this one actually wasn't too bad. I was pleasantly surprised. I think my expectations were very low, so I'm not sure exactly how everyone else would feel about it, but I was decently impressed considering the sort of negatives that you might guess from such a low-budget production. So, the plot of JeruZalem is, and that is, yeah, it's Jerusalem with a Z. It's like Jerusalem, but with a Z. The plot of it is essentially, these two tourists go to Jerusalem on vacation, sort of a getaway trip. It seems like they're going to be there for a pretty considerable amount of time. Unfortunately, while they are there, shit kind of hits the fan, and I won't reveal in what sort of way, but it's not something you want to be in Jerusalem for, so the movie was decently filmed. A lot of that probably has to do with the gorgeous sets and locations. It was filmed on location in Jerusalem, so, you get to see some really neat historical sites. And so, okay, one of the two girls, she has these glass, like, it's sort of like Google Glass. I don't think they call it Google Glass. I think it's something else, but she refers to it as glass. And they're, those eye glasses that have stuff pop up on the screen. It has its own internet browser and Wi-Fi and all of that stuff. And, it was sort of a neat sort of design choice, I guess, for the script. It did have its negatives, basically that pretty much the whole film is somewhat shaky. That being said, I thought the shakiness was sort of rounded and less sharp most of the time, if you sort of understand what I'm trying to say by that. Like, the movements didn't feel quite so jerky. They felt more like they came in curves, and I think that really helped make it feel slightly more stable than some other movies that I could think of. There's a movie called Nightlight, I believe, that I watched, and I reviewed it in text a while back, and that one takes the perspective of a flashlight. It's really interesting, but the shakiness is so incredible. It's kind of disappointing in that way, and those are much more sharp jerks than you get in this. I think the idea of it was a little better than the execution ever could have been, and you can tell clearly in Nightlight that they've tried to limit the shakiness as much as they possibly can, but it's just not really possible. In this, it was a little bit more rounded, so I did appreciate that. The opening narration kind of made me, I think it wasn't totally necessary to the film to have it. I'm not somebody who thinks that you shouldn't have narration in films just completely flat out, but it was a little overlong, I felt like, and most of that narration could have been just told through the visuals that were happening at the time. There wasn't a total need to have the narrator come in and explain that stuff. Some of it kind of should have been done by a narrator, but the majority of it, it's almost like commentary, and it's on what's happening on screen, and I didn't feel that was totally necessary. That being said, it's not a huge problem. It doesn't go on for, the whole first 15 minutes of the movie or anything, but it was sort of a more sloppy narration than it might have been, and if you don't like narration, it's probably going to drive you nuts. The effects they weren't too bad in the beginning. This was aided by film grain quite a bit, but they're not very good through most of the rest of the movie. They are CG for the most part. There are some practical effects and makeup, and those aren't too bad. I did think those were a little better quality. They're still not great quality, but they were a little better quality than the CG. That being said, it's not for lack of effort to cover the sort of, not great CG. They definitely did the best they could. They put people farther away from the camera. They put people sort of in darkness, or they would show it just in sort of flashes as the character with the glasses. That's the camera's perspective is from her glasses. And she would be like looking around, and so you'd only get like a glimpse of it. And I think that covered for some of it, but there are definitely a few moments that you see the sort of poor quality of the CG, and that's kind of unfortunate. I can kind of forgive it in this movie. Again, it had a very small budget. You can find the number online. Definitely not the smallest budget, but it had a pretty small budget, and I assume some of that had to go towards all of the filming locations that they chose. There were a ton of them that, like I said, were historical sites, and that's probably not the easiest thing to get permits for. I assume you have to pay for those sorts of permits. I don't know how the JeruZalem film community works, but yeah. So I think I went a little bit off topic when I was talking about the glasses before, when I was trying to explain that. There are a number of historical sites, as I said, in the film, and one of the things that's really interesting is, rather than having some, that trope of like a tour guide for another group really loudly telling you where they are, as happens in a lot of, foreign films or American movies that are filmed in foreign countries, they didn't do that. Instead, what they would have is have a visual pop up with information about the site. So when they went to the Western Wall, when they went to Solomon's Caves, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, bunch of different places, they would have that information pop up on the screen, so oh, this is like a place, this is a thing. All of these filming locations are just absolutely gorgeous, obviously. They're the reason why somebody who's not of a religious inclination would go to JeruZalem. They're really incredible sites. And it's kind of neat to see this sort of stuff going on in, such an old city there. They do give a very nice intro to the glass technology, in the scene where she first, is playing around with the glasses. You can see her doing all of these different sorts of things with it to see what it's capable of before you really get into the horror movie proper and be like, well, wait a minute, they've never shown them do that. Like, why is this all of a sudden popping up? I did feel like that was a pretty neat way of covering for those problems that might come up later if all of a sudden the glass has new functionality that you've never seen before in the middle of a scene where it's sort of important that you believe what's happening. I thought it was a great idea to use the the glass to sort of handle messages from home without having to spend time on them in dialogue. Sometimes you'll get like chat screens or, Skype or something like that will come up on the screen. And you can, with the text ones, you can just read, "Hey, how are you doing? You must be asleep," whatever it is, people from back home, rather than having to put those really in the film and just add additional scenes. You can just look over and read all of that stuff going on and know, of course, they haven't just been left on their own with, nobody back home worried about them or whatever. It also, I thought, added quite a bit to the pacing and keeping the pace towards when the horror movie proper begins sort of up, because you could get calls in the middle of when stuff's going on and, she's already wearing the glasses. She needs the glasses. So, somebody would pop up with a Skype call and she'd be able to talk to them, but they're still running around and trying to, escape or whatever. And I did think that did, sort of humanize the situation at the same time as it allowed for the pace to continue as it wanted to. So I thought that was pretty clever. This was clearly a movie built with a location in mind from the start, which again makes sense. They're Israeli directors. It's it's filmed in Israel, so it really makes the film feel very cohesive. They use certain features of the historical sites and other stuff that's there that isn't in another city, and fold that into the story in a way that makes it very clear that there's no way that this film was ever going to be made anywhere else. If you tried to take this script and recreate it somewhere else, short of just rebuilding fake sites like this, that were supposed to be that, you couldn't do it. They just don't have these sort of features. And I thought that was kind of neat. It really gave you a sense of location. It gave you a sense of the culture to a certain extent. And that's another thing that's really interesting. They do give you a very good sense of the culture, Jerusalem being shared by the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Catholicism, and then Judaism and Islam. So it's kind of neat to be able to see all of these, disparate groups of people. And there are characters of all three faiths. And it's interesting to see how they interact with one another. As far as negatives are concerned, with the exception of the CG, there were a couple of things. Really the main one for me, and this one kind of bugged me more than most of the other problems with the film. There was a pretty important scene in the movie that either was missing or the filmmakers failed to emphasize the scene if it existed. It's very possible that it happened on screen and there's just so much chaos happening that perhaps I missed this little bit, but when it comes back around and it becomes important later, I had no idea that it was sort of a thing, that had been a part of the story. And I felt like that should have been a pretty easy thing to display on screen in a way that was, very obvious and very whatever. Again, I may have just missed it. Maybe it happened and I was paying attention to something else, but it was sort of, it should have been more properly emphasized if it was there. If the scene wasn't there, then, that's a whole nother problem. So there were some pretty bad accents in this movie, but the acting for the most part was pretty good other than that. The characters I thought were fairly likable, and they made sense for the particular area and time that they were trying to go for in this movie. I mean, it takes place in present day. But, it was, I don't know, I thought it was pretty good. Again, my opinion very well could be colored by the fact that I just assumed this was going to be the worst movie. But, I was decently impressed with it. As far as people that I would recommend it to, that's kind of hard. If you're interested in seeing the historical sites in Jerusalem, and you like horror movies, there's probably not a better option that I know of. I haven't seen a ton of Israeli films, so that's kind of, so, I mean, maybe this happens more frequently than I think. Maybe they're really big on trying to publicize those, but to my knowledge, that's not the case. I would think anyone who is into sort of religious studies or the idea of a semi-religious based horror movie, this would be a pretty obvious choice. There's not a whole lot of other people I can think of, honestly, at least specifically. I think it would appeal to a number of people, but it's really more down to personal taste. It's definitely not the best movie. If you don't enjoy low-budget horror, then you're probably not going to enjoy this. But I thought it was pretty good. While I've never seen any films that quite did this in a way that didn't feel overbearing or that didn't feel like it was trying to push a message on you, I have read a couple of short stories. There was one particular one that I remember that kind of had a similar feel to this, even though the plot is totally different. It's in the Mammoth Book of Vampire Stories by Women. My mother bought me that once when she had to stop by Barnes & Noble when I was in, I think, middle school, and I read the death out of that thing. It was, by the end of it, it was just in tatters, basically. And yeah, there was one particular story in there, if you have it, you probably know which one I'm talking about, that had a sort of similar feel to it. It's the one that takes place in Israel, in present-day Israel. So, yeah, I mean, but other than that and a couple of other, full-length novels that I'd rather not talk about because they get a little closer, I definitely haven't seen a movie quite like this that, again, didn't feel overbearing or trying to push some sort of religious message on you, whatever religion it comes from. Whether my expectations of this colored my opinion of the movie, I do think there is some things that are worth watching in this movie. There's a lot that sort of comes around in a way that I found surprisingly good, and certainly not exactly what I was expecting. There were also a couple of places where I felt like they were headed for a plot hole, and they were pretty decent at getting around those. There are definitely a couple of things that are problematic, but there were some other areas that I felt they sidestepped everything very gracefully. I think the script in this movie is pretty decent. Some of the writing was really good. The dialogue felt, like I said, fairly natural, even if some of the actors had not so great accents. It's not really a problem for me, personally, in this particular style of film. It's really hard to judge anything as far as cinematography is concerned because, like I said, the entire movie takes place through those glasses. And, I mean, there are some interesting shots, to be sure, but it's not... There's no way to really make it artful in the way that it zooms or pans or whatever. It's literally just like the way a person turns their head. So it's almost completely devoid of cinematography in the way that they just nullify that entire factor by putting the entire camera through that. And being that it's on a person's head and not in their hand, like in Nightlight, you can't, there's no way to even angle anything in a way that's not coming from a very fixed, around 5.5 feet height. I don't know how tall the actor is, but somewhere in that range, I'm assuming. Yeah, so if you're interested, it's been on Netflix for a long time. I've been avoiding it since basically I started this project. I do think it's been here since maybe the first day that I started doing the text reviews even. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely not bad. If you've seen everything else on Netflix, if you also avoided this because you saw the Z in JeruZalem and just assumed it was going to be bad, it's a lot better than I was expecting personally. They are working on a sequel, which I would definitely watch, and it won't have the glasses. So if that bugged you for whatever reason, if that particular thing, if it made the film feel a little bit too shaky or something like that, you should definitely be pleased by, that information, I guess. So, no clue when it's being released or anything like that. I just happened to see in a search result that they were working on a second one. So, yeah, so that was JeruZalem from 2015. So for every episode that I record, there will be one new review for a movie that I watched the very day that I recorded. And there's going to be 1 or 2 other reviews detached. Those are basically just me going back over my old text reviews and talking about the movies that I reviewed previously and any recollections that I have left about those. Aided, of course, by the text review itself. I assume somebody listening to a podcast isn't really interested in going back and, reading 260-something text reviews. So, the one I want to talk about today is They Look Like People. This is also from 2015. It's an independent film about a man that believes something is taking over the bodies of unsuspecting humans. He finds himself in the city despite the potential danger there due to the high population, which is basically where the story starts out. Now, I should really admit here that I really appreciate the sort of body snatcher genre when it's done well. The idea that anyone around you, your friends or family or, just the strangers that you see, the idea that they could be infected with something or be a part of some huge conspiracy or anything like that is really intriguing to me. The latter of those sentiments, the large conspiracy, I think that's something that most people have felt, at least to, some sort of a milder degree. It might be something like social anxiety where you think everybody's talking behind your back. That is sort of a very small, little tiny bit of paranoia. Hopefully, at least, paranoia that I think every human sort of indulges in. And the body snatcher genre pretty much encompasses that fear and then amplifies it, to 100. This genre is a complete indulgence of that sentiment, that feeling of paranoia. For others, it's the body snatcher genre sort of represents the fear that we have that we may be slowly losing our minds without knowing it. This is sort of the other side of the coin on that, with the people who think that other people are being taken over or something like that. And this plays to sort of that feeling that we may be doing something that we don't realize is totally outside of the norm, and everybody else can see it but us. That, again, it's a social anxiety thing, so me being someone with social anxiety, that has always really appealed to me. I don't really consider myself to be a very paranoid person, but as far as social paranoia goes, I definitely have that in spades. This movie is a really good representation of those fears, I thought. The characters they're pretty relatable and they're even somewhat endearing at points, and the acting is mostly pretty good. There's a couple of rough patches, certainly. The relationship between the two main characters, they're sort of buddies. It's quite enjoyable to watch it unfold, and it feels fairly realistic to the circumstances. It's really odd in all the same ways that relationships with real people are odd, and something that doesn't always get captured well in film, unless, maybe it's a quirky comedy, and even those are usually overblown and don't really feel totally realistic. I thought this did a really good job of sort of playing that line of being like, this is totally weird, but it's totally something I've seen people do or I've done. I didn't think the filmmakers overplayed their hand, and I felt like that would have been really easy in this movie. I think they knew what they could achieve and what was better left to the imagination, and it served this movie really well. For the most part, the movie is pretty decently filmed, but early on, I did notice that there was some shaky camera work, that it was shaky enough that it made it, actively distracting. Either later on in the film, I started to become more engaged, and I didn't care about it anymore and notice or pick up on it anymore, or it did improve later on in the film. Whatever the case, for me personally, it improved because I didn't have to see it anymore. The other thing that was a little sloppy in this movie was, again, in the beginning, where it seemed to be, there was some ADRing that needed a better edit, or perhaps even to be re-recorded. ADR, for people who are not familiar with the term, it's automated dialogue replacement. Essentially, if something happens and it turns out you didn't record the sound well enough while you were filming something, or if they've made script changes, after the scene itself has already been filmed, they'll go back and re-record dialogue and put it in there, into the movie, into the scene where it needed to be. And usually these days it's pretty seamless. They do a pretty good job at, even in small films, at putting it in a way that you don't really pick up on it necessarily. In this film, there were definitely a couple of places where it would be impossible not to notice these problems. A character would say something in like a really giggly voice, but when they showed the actor, he'd be completely stone-faced, stuff like that. It only happened a few times that I really noticed, and again, it was mostly in the beginning, but it did distract me, much like the problem with the shakiness, again, in the beginning. The pacing of the movie feels like it might be a little slow for some, but I did enjoy it. There's very little to be said about the movie without spoilers, just the way that the movie goes. It really 100% can be spoiled. There probably are parts of the movie that some people won't like, but personally, I thought it was worth watching. And at 80 minutes, it's not much of a time sink if you didn't enjoy it. If you like the body snatcher genre, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's not exactly like most of the body snatcher movies that you've probably seen. And if you don't have any real thoughts about your feelings on body snatcher movies, it's still not a bad choice. I could be totally wrong about this because I didn't take any specific notes about it in my review, but I do seem to recall that the lighting was pretty decent throughout the movie. And the cinematography, I'm, again, totally unsure of, but other than the shakiness in the beginning, I did think there were some pretty neat moments later on in the film with the cinematography. If you have social anxiety and like to have it worked out by horror movies in some way, this isn't a terrible way to do it. Certainly there's not too much of real social anxiety situations in it, but again, if you take it the same way that I sort of do as an extension of, the sort of paranoia about what people are saying or doing around you, or what people's real feelings are about you, sort of like that. If you think of the body snatcher genre as a sort of extension of that, this isn't a terrible way to go. And regardless, honestly, it's just a pretty good movie. I think there are some people who won't necessarily enjoy it. The person who watched it with me didn't enjoy it as much as I did, and I think got sort of mad by part of the movie, actually. But I don't really specifically remember what it was that they disliked, so I'd tell you, but I don't know. This was on Netflix. I believe it still is. This certainly wouldn't go into my top 10 or anything like that, but I definitely think it's on the upper half of the 270-something films that I've seen for this, so you can do a lot worse out of the things that I've seen for sure. Okay, so I think that'll kind of do it for today. Because this is sort of a shorter episode, I was sort of looking ahead to see what other reviews I did around this period that I could maybe add a second one onto here, but just looking ahead, there's so many of these that I've seen with Sam that I know he would want to talk about that I really don't want to do those without him. So I guess I'll just call it a night for this one. Nice short episode. Not bad. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, comment, whatever, whatever the site will allow you to do that you found this on. If you're looking for a different place to listen to this than wherever you found it, I'm on YouTube, Stitcher, iTunes, Podcast Addict, pretty much any of the podcatchers, actually. And if you're looking for me on social media, you can find me usually at Recluse Horror, no matter where I am on any website, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, though I don't do anything on Instagram currently. I really should. And yeah, if you would like to contact me and ask me any questions or, I don't know, yell at me or something, you can find me at reclusehorror@gmail.com, or obviously you can message me or direct message me or whatever on any of my social media sites. I'd love to hear from you if you like the show, if you don't like the show. I don't really care. So yeah, thanks for listening, and so yeah, go out there and watch some decent horror movies. That's another thing. If you'd like to make any suggestions for whatever reason of movies that I do in the future, I'll definitely take them into consideration. I am a poor person, so I don't really have a lot of money for buying things, but if it's on Netflix and I haven't seen it, or if it's on Hulu, then I'll definitely consider checking it out. Well, thank you, and have a great evening.